All right, I'm going to get started. So welcome everyone to the program. I'm glad you could join us today. My name is Tara Cole, and I am the Museum Services Coordinator at the Oregon Historical Society. I am thrilled to be the moderator of today's program, which is going to be a photographic tour of the OHS exhibit, We Are the Rose City, A History of Soccer in Portland. So the format of the program, the presenters will speak for about an hour, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions and answers. So before we begin, I do have a few slides to quickly cover before I introduce our presenters. So next slide. The next presenter in our virtual Hatfield lecture series is Evan Thomas. It's going to take place on Tuesday, January 12th from 7 to 8:30. Ticket prices and more information on Evan Thomas, including the video trailer for his lecture and new book titled First, Sandra Day O'Connor, is on our website at www.ohs.org/events. Next slide. I want to take a moment to recognize that Oregon is Indigenous land. The Oregon Historical Society is located in downtown Portland, which is the traditional homeland to the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kayupuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. Next slide. So the reason we are all here is because of this exhibit and a love for soccer. Right now, OHS is closed to the public, but the exhibit will be extended and is on display through September 26th of 2021. I want to take a brief moment to thank our generous sponsors that are listed on the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. So the exhibit took about a year of planning from kickoff to opening day. The exhibit could not have been done without the support of many, including the curators from Historical Researchers Associates, which we'll hear from later. The show was designed by Brian Potter Design, fabricated by PVS Graphics and David Bertman Designs, with video production by Sam Bareski and Sepe Productions. OHS museum staff oversaw the entire project with additional support from OHS library staff. Next slide. The entire project was a community collaboration with contributions from the 107 Independent Supporters Trust, Rose City Riveters, Timbers Army, staff from the Portland Timbers and Portland Thorns, as well as retired players, coaches, staff, and owners from former professional teams in Portland and others in the soccer community. These folks helped with content, images, and artifacts. A lot of them are joining us for today's program, so thank you. We could not have done this show without your support. Next slide. So from the OHS Museum Store, I'm pretty excited about this. It's the We Are the Rose City scarf. This limited edition scarf is a tie-in to our exhibit. A huge thank you to the 107 Independent Supporters Trust and No Pity Originals for this custom-made scarf. Scarves are $20, and you can purchase your scarf by emailing museumstore@ohs.org. And don't forget, OHS members, you can get 10% off by ordering through OHS. Okay, next slide. Great, so for anybody who has just joined us in the last few minutes, welcome to today's program. We are the Rose City, a history of soccer in Portland virtual tour. Our presenters today are Morgen Young, Libby Provost, and Mick Hoban. My name's Tara Cole, and I'll be the moderator of today's program. Next slide. So introducing tonight's presenters, Morgen Young is a senior historian with Historical Researchers Associates and one of the curators of the exhibit. Much of her work focuses on interpretive planning and exhibit development. Morgen has contributed to 50 interpretive projects, and 15 of those were exhibits at OHS. So if you've been to OHS, you have probably seen her work before. Libby Provost is also one of the curators of the exhibit. She's an architectural historian and interpretive specialist with HRA. At HRA, Libby works in both the History Division and Cultural Resource Management Division. Libby has worked as a consulting historian for 15 years. And Mick Hoban, who Morgen and Libby has nicknamed the third curator of the exhibit due to his invaluable help with the exhibit content. Mick started his professional football career with Aston Villa Football Club in Birmingham, England. His playing career continued in the North American Soccer League, with Atlanta, Denver, and Portland. In 1975, he was the first player signed by the Portland Timbers, where he played for 3 years and served as the team's community relations manager. After retiring as a professional footballer, he worked in sports marketing. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Morgan Young, and she's going to walk us through the first part of the exhibit.
Great, thanks, Tara. Well, as Tara mentioned, this is an exhibit about soccer. We focused on the professional game. And it's also an exhibit about community and Portland and Oregon, the community's love of soccer and how that's impacted the state. This is an overview of the exhibit itself. Hopefully a lot of folks will be able to come and see it in person. It's on display now when the museum is open, and as Tara mentioned, will be on display through September. It's 3,000 square feet. I'm going to do the first half of the exhibit, which is on the left side of the 3D rendering. And this is a chronological look at the history of professional soccer in Portland. And then Libby will take over and do the second half, which is presented topically. And then Mick and I will walk through the conclusion of the exhibit together, and then we'll answer some questions. Again, as Tara mentioned, this is a photographic tour of the exhibit, but there are a lot of great components that hopefully folks will be able to see in person soon, and those include audiovisual elements. The name of the exhibit, We Are the Rose City, comes from Timbers Army and Rose City Riveters chant, The Mighty PTFC, and you can hear that chant at the introduction of the exhibit, along with other chants, cheers, chainsaws, basically the soundscapes you would hear if you were in the stadium during a Timbers or Thorns game. And there were also 3 sections of the exhibit that we call digital hubs. And so if you're looking at the 3D rendering, there's a representation of a soccer ball that has projected video of games from the 1970s through 90s. Then there is the facade of Providence Park, and that has projected video of games from the 2000s and 2010s, as well as some TIFO displays from the Timbers Army and Rose City Riveters. And then the last digital hub is a jersey, and that has projected photographs from game moments of the last 10 years of the Timbers and last 7 years of the Thorns, as well as supporters' portraits. And so you can see that depiction. Next slide. So this is if you are standing outside the main gallery, and it's a TIFO that the 107ist Independent Supporters Trust made specifically for the exhibit. The 107ist is the nonprofit engine that includes the Timbers Army and Rose City Riveters, and they were a critical partner for us throughout this project. A TIFO is an Italian word for a display of support for a sports team, and the Timbers Army and Rose City Riveters are known for their elaborate TIFO displays on game days. So when the exhibit closes, this TIFO will go back to the 107ist. Next slide. This is the introduction of the exhibit. If you start with the image on the left, it walks you through what to expect. And one highlight of the introduction is our profile of scarf culture. And so it's a little hard to see, but the top image on the right, that's the original Timbers Army No Pity scarf sketch. It was made in the fall of 2002 by supporters who were meeting at the Bitter End pub. You can see both sides of the basically back of napkin sketch. We talk about a bit of that history. And then overhead, Libby and I carefully installed about 290 unique scarf designs, no repeated designs, multiple examples of the No Pity scarf over the years with different fringes. You can go to the next slide. So this is our first main section. There are about 10 sections overall in the exhibit, and this focuses on the first era of professional soccer in Portland, the North American Soccer League Portland Timbers. Soccer has been played in Portland since the 19th century. The first game played on the land that became Providence Park was played in 1893, but this show focuses on the professional team, so starting in 1975. The Timbers were part of the North American Soccer League. That was top tier soccer in the United States and Canada beginning in 1968. In the fall of 1974, John Gilbertson and Don Paul founded Oregon Soccer, Inc. They got investments from others in the area, and they were able to then raise enough money to purchase an NASL franchise team. That happened in January of 75. And then by May of that year, the Timbers played their very first game in what was then called Civic Stadium, now Providence Park. That first game was against the Seattle Sounders. Mick might be able to tell us some stuff about that when we have the Q&A at the end. During that first season, the Timbers earned the nickname Soccer City USA. They went to the league finals and were immensely popular. But that the NASL Timbers were never able to achieve that same level of success as they did that first season. They went to the playoffs in 78 and 81. In 1979, Oregon Soccer, Inc. sold the Timbers to Louisiana Pacific, which was then led by Harry Merlo. But he had to fold the team in 1982, and then the NASL as a league collapsed 2 years later. I want to point out in this photograph, Clive Charles, number 3. He was a legend. I'll talk more about him in the next exhibit, but he played for the Timbers from 1978 to 1981. After his death in 2003, the Timbers retired his jersey number, and it's the only jersey number that the team's ever retired. Next slide. So within each section of the exhibit, Libby and I developed different content sections. What I just showed in the previous slide was the overview, and here you can see the 2 other types of content sections. On the far left, you'll see ambassadors for the sport. That's a community context where we did a deeper dive into the impact of soccer on the community and vice versa. And then we did spotlights, and these are these crests. And so spotlights would be on people, events, and other topics. So for the community context here, that is a photograph of Mick Hoban in 1975 teaching a soccer clinic. When the Timbers started, soccer wasn't played as widely as it is now across Oregon. So the players, the team staff, the owners became ambassadors for both the team and the sport, and they traveled across Oregon teaching clinics. So they really helped grow the sport. And as an example of that, in 1975, there were about 4,000 kids playing soccer in Oregon. And last year, there are now 64,000 kids playing soccer in Oregon. So that was one of our goals of this exhibit, was to show how the sport has grown and how the professional teams influence that growth. Folks probably recognize the man wielding the chainsaw, which is Jim Serrell, better known as Timber Jim. He was a mascot during the NASL era, as well as later eras of the team. In the black and white photo is Clyde Best, who played for the Timbers. He's playing an indoor game at Memorial Coliseum. And the Timbers of this era played 2 seasons with the NASL of indoor soccer. And then quickly to look at the profiles, we have Mildred Schwab, who was a city commissioner and an absolute rabid soccer supporter. She's in the photograph, she's kicking out the ceremonial first ball in the very first game in 1975. Those pom-poms are part of her collection that she has at the Oregon Historical Society of Timbers memorabilia. We did a spotlight on Harry Merlo, the second owner of the team, a spotlight on the 1975 season, again, something Mick could speak to later, which was really a magical first season and laid the foundation for professional soccer being so successful here. This object is from that first season. It's owned by Oregon Historical Society librarian Scott Daniels. I believe he's been a season ticket holder in every Timber season since then. It cost $44 in 1975, the equivalent about $200 today. And then the last spotlight for this section is on Nike Soccer, which Mick was the very first employee of Nike Soccer and helped the Timbers become the first team in the world to have a professional Nike soccer equipment deal. Next slide. So Libby and I will also be highlighting some objects that you can see at the exhibit in person. If you start with the top left photograph, that's the original certificate that Oregon Soccer Inc. received from NASL, granting them a franchise. To the left of that is the original ballot that Oregon Soccer Inc. then sent around the state soliciting names for the team. Timbers was actually the second most popular name. The first most popular name was Pioneers, but that would have been a conflict with the Lewis and Clark mascot. So Timbers won. Some other suggestions were the Steelheaders, Raindrops, and Volcanoes. To the, I hear you laughing, Nick.
How lucky were we not to be Raindrops?
To the right of that, Kick Magazine, this was owned by Giselle Courier. Libby will mention her and her sister Paula. They were the most phenomenal of supporters through all eras of the Timbers. And Giselle's notes are throughout this Kick Magazine, as well as a ticket stub. There's a great collection of her soccer materials at the Historical Society Museum. This record is Green is the Color, which Eric Beck wrote, and that became a fight song for multiple eras of the Timbers. You can also see some gold cufflinks that have the Timbers logo. Harry Merlot gave these to his Louisiana Pacific Board of Directors. These belong to John Hart, who was on the board, and his grandson, John Strong, became the play-by-play announcer for the Timbers of Major League Soccer. And then a log slice that Timber Jim carved for John Bain when he scored a hat trick or 3 goals in a 1980 game against the Vancouver Whitecaps. The log slices weren't kept like they are now, so it's quite rare to have one 40 years later. Next slide. This is the next section of the exhibit, which focuses on the 1980s and 1990s, and there are several teams that comprise soccer of this era. So the Timbers of the NASL folded in 1982, but local soccer continued. In 1985, Clive Charles and Art Dixon founded FC Portland. And through FC Portland, they created a semi-professional men's team. The team was made up of local high school and college players. The large photograph is of Brent Goulet, who played for the team. So did Casey Keller and Scott Benedetti. The team played at Civic Stadium. Then in 1989, Dixon reincarnated the Timbers. And so FC Portland became the second iteration of the Portland Timbers when he purchased the team name, colors, and logo. The team then played 2 seasons and folded in 1990. Then in 1993, professional soccer returned to Portland with the Portland Pride. That was an indoor team through the Continental Indoor Soccer League, and that included former Timbers players like John Bain and Jim Gorsuch. The team was very popular. They played their games first at Memorial Coliseum and then at the Rose Garden when it first opened. But the league itself wasn't successful and collapsed in 1997. Then there was another indoor team, the Pythons, and they played for 2 seasons, 1998 and 1999, before they themselves folded. Next slide. So you can see the photographs on the top, on the right in the black and white, FC Portland Timbers, and then Portland Pride. So what Clive Charles was trying to do with FC Portland, and then later with the FC Portland Soccer Academy, was to create a youth system that was similar to what he had grown up with and what Mick had grown up with in England. He believed that Oregon could produce world-class players. And so this system was successful and continues to be successful, with coaches and players expanding the sport across the state. And so players that went through the FC Portland system then joined local college teams. Some became professional players, some joined national teams. And you can't see it in this photograph because it's small, but there is a young Tiffany Milbritt pictured here, and she's one of the most famous, if not the most famous, soccer players to come out of Oregon, playing on the national team. We did 2 profiles in this section. One on Clive Charles, who I mentioned was a very important both player and coach in Oregon. The photograph here is from 2002 when he was celebrating the University of Portland's women's soccer team winning the national championship. He had played on top level teams in the United Kingdom and then North America, but he arguably made a bigger impact as a coach. So he coached the men's and women's teams at the University of Portland, and then the US women's under-20 team and the US men's under-23 team. The objects that we highlighted are rings of his that his widow, Clarina Charles, lent to us, or lent to the museum. The one on the left is one that he received for participating in the 2000 Summer Olympics. He coached the men's team to a 4th place finish. That was the highest finish for a US men's team in the Olympics since 1904. And then the ring on the right is from winning that 2002 University of Portland women's team. And then we also highlighted John Bain. And John Bain played for 2 eras of the Timbers. He played for the NASL Timbers from 78 to 82, where he led scoring for the team. And then he was the player coach for the Portland Timbers from 1989 to 1990. Then he was the player coach for the Portland Pride from 93 to 96. He retired as a player and became a coach for the Westside Timbers, and he's now the director of the Westside Timbers. Next slide. So these are objects related to the 80s and 90s era of soccer in Portland. With the image on the left, the blue poster is from the very first Timbers reunion game. And those were very popular games played at Civic Stadium between former Timbers and then local college and amateur players. And that helped keep soccer at Civic Stadium even when there wasn't a semi-professional or professional team there. To the left of that is an FC Portland program from the first season of that team, in which they beat the Canadian national team 3-1. If you look at the photograph on the right, you can see we included this towel to represent the second iteration of the Timbers when Art Dixon renamed FC Portland, Portland Timbers. There's a game-worn Portland Pride jersey that former player Jason Boykoff lent us, some other Pride memorabilia, and then some items to represent the Portland Pythons. The jacket, which you can't quite see, it's folded, is a Pythons game-worn jacket from Jeff Betts, who played all eras of the Pride and the Pythons. Next slide. So this is the modern era of professional soccer in Portland. In 2001, the Timbers came back and they've been here ever since. The team played for a decade at the second tier of US professional soccer. They had many owners during this time, but now they are owned by Peregrine Sports, led by Merritt Paulson. Then in 2013, Portland Thorns FC joined the scene, and they're also owned by Paulson and Peregrine Sports. They debuted as part of the National Women's Soccer League. The Thorns won the championship during that inaugural season. They were first coached by Cindy Parlow-Cone, who this year became the first female president of the US Soccer Federation. In 2017, the Thorns became the best attended women's professional team in the world and won their second championship. In the photograph, we have Footy Danso, Jack Dewsbury, and Steve Purdy celebrating a goal during the home debut of the Timbers of the MLS era, Major League Soccer. And then for the community context of this section, we talked about the origins of the Timbers Army. That group started in 2001 when brothers Stephen and Jim Lenhart and others started congregating in section 107 of the stadium. And they would meet at the Bitter End Pub, which used to be right near the stadium, and they would go over and watch games together. There was another group made up of punk rockers and anti-racist skinheads who also started attending games in 2001. They brought with them the culture of European chants, as well as laid a foundation of zero tolerance for intolerance with their stance against racism, homophobia, sexism, and xenophobia. And that culture continues today, and Libby will touch on that in her section. So you had these two groups merge the following year in 2002, and they became the Timbers Army. Next slide. So we did two spotlights in this section. The first on Christine Sinclair. She is the captain of both the Thorns and has been since the beginning of the team and the Canadian women's national team. This year, she became the world leader for the most international goals scored by any soccer player. She has deep roots in Portland soccer. Her brothers, Bruce and Bryant Gant, played for the NASL Timbers, and then she herself was recruited by Clive Charles to play at the University of Portland, where she helped lead the team to 2 national championships. The object we're highlighting in this section is the 2020 primary jersey for the Thorns, which the team actually donated to the OHS Museum, and that was a very exciting addition to their collections. And then the other spotlight is on Adidas and MLS, and I say the team name like a German because they're from Herzogenaurach, Germany, which is my mother's hometown. And Diego Chara is posing in the 2020 Timbers home uniform. All MLS teams wear Adidas uniforms, footwear, and other equipment. And in Portland, Adidas is a local partner since the German company's North American headquarters are here. Next slide. And then these are objects to represent the modern era of the Timbers. So if you start on the far left, there is a Portland Reign jersey, game-worn jersey on loan from Nicole Wilcox-Strong, a former player. The Reign were a precursor to professional women's soccer in Portland. They played here from 2000 to 2003, and then again from 2008 to 2012. Then to the right of that is a t-shirt, supporter-made and designed t-shirt to represent the perfect season of the Timbers U23 team. And the design is based on a Timbers Army chant that's sung to the tune of the Toys R Us theme. So it has Jeffrey the giraffe in the design. There's also a cleat from Byron Alvarez, who was a player on the Timbers during the United Soccer League era. You can see the Sunshine trailer. That's a photograph from Stephen Lenhart. That's the cover of the 2010 season ticket packet. The Sunshine trailer was a well-known place that supporters would go before games to buy merchandise. And then there are bobbleheads of Takayuki Suzuki, another USL era player, and Timber Jim. Next slide. So looking at, it's the same case, just the other side of it. If you start on the right, there's a handout that was given at a Thorns game to celebrate players who had been selected to play for national teams. So during the 2015 Women's World Cup, and they represented Australia, Canada, England, Germany, and the United States. There are also scarves to commemorate the inaugural seasons of the Thorns, of the NWSL, and the Timbers of MLS. Some patches made by local company Dark Horse Comics that show Christine Sinclair, Tobin Heath, and Lindsay Horan as superheroes. And then we were developing this exhibit as the COVID-19 pandemic was unfolding and is still unfolding. And so we discussed the impacts of the pandemic on both the Thorns and Timbers seasons in an object label for a face mask that you can see in the far left-hand corner of this case. And the mask itself is locally made from upcycled jerseys. So next slide. And this is, if you're in the exhibit, you're about to turn the corner and Libby's going to take over, but this shows you another view of the stadium with the projected video in that middle arch, and that's a clip from the Timbers 2015 MLS Championship. So next slide, and then I will hand it over to Libby.
Well, hi, I just want to thank everybody for coming. It's a great opportunity for us to get to share this with you because, even if we weren't in a pandemic, we had the Timbers and the Thorns have so many fans worldwide that this is a great chance for everyone to get to see parts of the exhibit. Although, we're able to share some of it with you, but there's a lot more there than we're able to do in this hour. So know that there's more on the wall. And I'll just say that I've been really honored to work on this. I grew up in the area. I went to Portland Pride games in high school and early Timbers games in the early 2000s, and more recently some Thorns games, but I really knew very little about soccer and especially about the community aspect and what an impact soccer has on the community, both locally and worldwide. So it's been really fun learning about it. So that's, this section focuses on that, club and community. So Morgen introduced the 107 Independent Supporters Trust. I was able to meet with some representatives. So they are the body behind the Timbers Army and the City Riveters. And just people gave so much of their time and to answer questions and to help me along to understand. So I really wanted to, I could see how much it matters to them to be able to give to the community and promote their ethos of radical inclusion. So it's not just about the game that happens on the field, but it's about much more. And so, if you go to a game, in this section, we talk about how if you go to a game, especially a Timbers or Thorns game, that so much of the environment is from these supporters groups. And they will do chants and fly flags and smoke bombs and all kinds of things to create that dynamic environment that make it so special. So I think let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Here you get an idea of what that side of the gallery looks like. Of course, much more scarves hung overhead. You won't be able to tell here, but we did try even to move the some of the scarves that were based on different, almost like inside jokes. If you're in the City Riveters of Timbers Army, there's a lot of things that they celebrate that somebody going to the game might not know everything about it. So it's great that we got a variety of scarves. Go to the next slide, please. So there on the left are some examples of TIFO. In the middle is a rail banner. So that's about 9 feet tall. That is a small TIFO compared to some of the giant ones that hang from the ceiling. That is an image. It's based on a portrait of a cassette from Les Mis, and it is flown at games against Vancouver and Seattle. It has a Cascadia flag in the background. And, I should say that and most of the objects in this section were lent to us to use for the exhibit by 107ist. To the left of Cassette there, you can see, so it says, you see the word destroy. That was part of a very elaborate Timbers Army TIFO from 2016, I believe. And we had this great opportunity to help you understand the scale of it. That eye that's to the left of the destroy, that is a portion of the original TIFO. It's about 4 feet by 5 feet, It's now framed, but that is canvas. So that was the Martian's right eye. If you can, if you can get an idea there. In person, I think it makes a little bit more sense, but these are gigantic displays that they put on. In the case there, I'm not going to go through everything because it just isn't time, but there's a lot of the ephemera to help you get a feeling for what the Timbers Army and the Rose City Riveters, that is it's homespun, like homemade, not mass-produced feeling, but there's things that they'll produce and trade with each other and sell to fans. So lots of patches and stickers. In the middle of the case is concept art. So that, again, back to TIFO, that is an example of when they're going to design something, they'll start with something, a sketch or a small painting, and then scale it. So that was neat to be able to show that. And there's video. We have video of that TIFO being unveiled, displayed in the exhibit. So that's pretty cool. On the right there is a drum that belongs to a man who's known lovingly as Drum Man. And I was really excited to get to show this in the exhibit. He's been a fan since the early days and is known for playing that drum. So there's an image on the bottom right of your screen that shows some fanzines. That was from the back of the case. So I have that other photo there for you to see. Some fanzines, and then the hat. It's not the right, what's a better word for it? I can't think of a word better than a helmet, right? That belonged to a very well-known and popular Timbers Army supporter, and from the very early days of the Timbers Army, Hartmut Bless, and he was known as General Howie. So it's really nice of 107 is to let us display that. And in this section, we also include a spotlight on the capos. So I like to think of them as fans who are they're so into their game and into the team that they're willing to watch the crowd as much as they are the game, because they do so much of that work orchestrating the environment that makes the stadium so dynamic by leading the crowd. And featured there is a megaphone or bullhorn that was used by a well-known capo named Pong. Next slide. And also in this section, we have a spotlight on Timber Jim and then Timber Joey. Timber Joey took over in 2008. When they saw the slab of that log, so the log is known as the victory log, we were able to get a portion of the 2019 victory log. That's what's there. And Timber Joey lent a saw of his and some scarves. If you've been to a home game, you see he'll drape these scarves that are donated by supporters over the log. And so here's a spot for a photo op that you can pose and pretend to be Timber Joey. And to the right of that is Morgen introduced the Courier Sisters. We were, so super fans and have done so much for the teams and the supporters groups. And so we have the jacket that belonged to Giselle and the scarf that belonged to Paula. And their memory lives on through the Giselle Courier Scholarship Fund, which supports soccer education activities for youth in the area. And then the community context for this section is, you see there's a picture on the bottom right. It's called the Iron Front flag, or the Iron Front symbol. That symbol it's the three arrows pointing down to the left, originated in Europe in the 1930s to represent being anti-monarchism, anti-communism, and anti-fascism. And the symbol has reemerged in soccer stadiums as part of wanting to show being inclusive, this radical inclusion that is so important and part of the mantra of, the Timbers Army and the Rose City Riveters. Their mantra is, if you want to be Timbers Army or you want to be Rose City Riveters, you already are. It's this very welcoming and inclusive statement that they make, not only for the players on the field, but the fans as well, and in the whole community. And that last season, this flag became really pretty controversial, and some stadiums wouldn't allow it to be flown. And in Portland, this also, it started, there was a lot of back and forth between the front office and the supporters groups on whether or not they could fly that flag. So next slide, please. This is a next section of the exhibit, about soccer being a universal language. This is something that I met with Mick Hoban early on, and we had this great conversation where he really opened my eyes to the worldwide aspect of soccer. I really had no idea that it's played on such a global scale. And a big part of that is that soccer doesn't require any fancy, you don't have to have a lot of fancy gear. You can play without shoes, you can play on a dirt road. So it's something that's accessible to a lot of people. And in this section, that's what we look at, is that this is such a universal language that people can communicate with. Next slide. So here on the left, there's a spotlight of the Portland World Soccer Tournament. This is organized by the Portland Parks and Rec. This last summer would have been the 11th year, I believe, of the tournament. Every year, they bring together hundreds of people from, I think in 2019, it was 450 players from 30 different countries, all youth up to age 24, I believe. So it's a great example of that, communicating, using language as a communication tool, people from all over the world. And in this section, we spotlight Nadia Nadim and Alex Nemo, two players whose skills are really developed. They're refugees, and their skills are both developed in refugee camps. And then Nadia went on to play. She played for the Thorns for a short time, and Alex Nemo came to Portland as a very young man, and he was coached and under Clive Charles and had a lot of success as a young man. And also in this section, the community context is about refugees in Oregon. It really just scratches the surface, but it's intended for people to understand that the refugee community in Oregon is very large, and often the rec leagues in Portland are very popular among the refugee community. So next slide. This section is City of Champions. These teams have done a lot of winning, and we focus on the success of the Timbers and the Thorns, but also the individual players who have contributed to their countries at a national level through the Olympics and World Cups. So next slide. I'll get back to City Champions in a minute, but I wanted you to have a concept of what this side of the gallery looks like. More scarves, and then on the left you can see that cutout that looks like a jersey. That's one of the digital components of the exhibit, and so it's rotating images, as Morgan had said. Next slide. So this I think of as the championship case, or the trophy case. In the middle is a trophy for the NASL. It's from 1975 for the NASL era Timbers. For participating in the Western Conference Championship. On the left is the two red items. So the flag is from the 2013 Thorns Championship, signed by former players, and the scarf represents their 2017 championship. On the right there is the Timbers 2015 MLS Cup Championship, and we have two rings from championship games, one for the Timbers, one for the Thorns, that the team owners donated to the 107ist, which is, they're really neat to see up close. I'll say that, it's kind of hard to get the concept of it here, but it's very nice of them to let us include them in the exhibit. And I'm happy to say that this section is already outdated. So this last year, the team, as a curator, that's difficult for me. Morgan can attest, the whole time I was like, we're gonna be outdated. Especially as COVID continued to impact the game. So in this past season, both the MLS and the National Women's Soccer League created some new tournaments that the players participated in when stadiums were closed. And so the Thorns made it to the quarterfinals of their tournament, and the Timbers won their tournament. So maybe at some point we'll have to update that and get some new objects. Next slide. And here are the spotlights on, we have Diego Valeri's, this ball. So he's a very well-known and liked player. This ball is it's known as the 27-second ball because Valeri scored in the 2015 Timbers Championship game. He scored the first goal in only 27 seconds, which is pretty amazing if you watch much soccer. And so he donated this ball to the supporters groups to recognize the contribution that they make. And then on the right is Adriana Franch. She's known as one of the best goalkeepers in the league. And I just became a big fan of hers throughout this. So I was really happy to feature her. And there's no special story behind the cleat, just it's cool. I like her and it's autographed. And then on the left side is the community context section here, equal pay for equal work. We really wanted to draw attention to the U.S. women's national team has done a lot in recent years to try to draw attention to the pay inequities between the U.S. men's soccer team and the U.S. women's soccer team. And here in that image, this was just from past March at the She Believes Cup. The U.S. women's national team, they wore their jerseys inside out in protest of that pay inequity. And then of course they went on to win the tournament that day. So next slide. And then this is the last section that I'll talk about, spread the love. Here we really wanted to draw attention to how much, well, as it says there on the community context, community building is done through soccer. The former players and current players do a lot of outreach through the Thorns and Timbers organizations. They do it through called Stand Together. And then the 107ists have a lot of many different outlets for donating money and volunteer hours. And it's really with this mantra called spread the love. That's a quote that's attributed to Timber Jim, that it's about how much you can give back to the community. And in that, the context there where it says community building through soccer, it's a focus on local organizations that are doing outreach to youth to support them. Next slide. And then last here, so on the left, it says, let's all pitch in. That is a spotlight on Operation Pitch Invasion, which is a 107ist group. And they, through different initiatives, they do a lot to bring soccer to areas throughout the city and the Portland metro area and futsal courts, sometimes transforming school blacktops to create a play space that wasn't there before. And so in the image there, it's at Bless Field from 2014. That was done in partnership with Stand Together, and it's named after Howie Bless, who I spoke of earlier. And they've had a huge impact with being able to bring play surfaces to youth in Portland. And then on the right, just finally, the Thorns really have done a lot to try to support girls and women through different initiatives and through different camps and things. And so that photo there is of girls of the game. After home games, some girls get to meet some of the players and present them with roses. So I will hand it off now to Morgan and Mick.
Yeah, you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and then turn it over to Mick to elaborate. But this is the conclusion of our exhibit, and we call it the Soccer Universe. And this was something that Mick did the foundational research for us. It's really impressive to see this in person. It's 240 square feet that shows the internet connectivity of soccer in Oregon, focusing particularly on Portland. Mick and I and Libby and everyone involved in the team, we wanted to show the magnitude of soccer in Oregon. And so through this graphic, we're documenting various levels of play that include youth, high school, college, semi-professional, professional, and then entities like clubs, leagues, associations, and businesses that make up soccer in the state. So whenever possible, we included dates for when these various entities were formed. When we started conceptualizing this, we were debating about including individuals, but just thought that that was going to get super complicated. So we focused on entities. And by including the dates for a lot of them, that enabled us to show when and where growth occurred in the sport. So some quick stats as you're looking at this wall. There are 613 individual entries in the universe. All these little dots represent an entry. The circles represent different decades. So it will start with 1950s, 1960s, and then go outward. We only included entities that are still around. So if a high school stopped a program, we didn't include that. If a university stopped a program or the university went away, we didn't include that. The exception being the professional and semi-professional teams. So of the 613 entries, that includes 8 professional teams, 9 semi-professional teams, 45 college programs in which we included men's and women's with founding dates, 340 high school programs divided by boys and girls programs, just to show how that growth occurred. And then 142 youth clubs and camps. And then we also have entries for officials organizations, adult soccer leagues, and soccer related businesses. So if you go to the next slide. And then to further show this interconnectivity, we looked at 10 individuals, and Mick will elaborate on at least one of these, but we profiled Scott Benedetti, Jimmy Conway, Marco Farfan, Kendall Johnson, Tiffany Milbritt, Megan Rapino, Laura Schott, Janine Sparza, Scott Thompson, and Jim Tercy. And you might be able to see in this image that, so if you look at Tiffany Milbritt, she has a color around her profile, and then there are dotted lines that connect from her profile to where she went to high school and where she went to college, so that you can really see how this all connects together. So with these 10 players or 10 individuals that we highlighted, they include players, coaches, directors, owners. 6 of the 10 were born in Oregon. They represent all eras of the Portland Timbers and the Portland Thorns. At the semi-professional level, they represent FC Portland men's and women's challenge teams, and the Portland Timbers of the Western Soccer League. That first year was actually, they were considered semi-professional in 1989, when the first year of the second iteration, and the Portland Reigned. We also have 15 youth clubs, 9 high schools, and 9 colleges represented. And within the universe, we just focused on Oregon, but through these profiles, we were able to mention if people were associated with national teams. And through these profiles, we have folks who played for or coached for national teams for the United States, Republic of Ireland, and Jordan. So now I will stop talking and turn it over to Mick for his insight.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you everybody for tuning in. It's been quite a project. I've enjoyed it thoroughly, especially working with the curators. It's a historical perspective, and I'd say up front that I also, whilst it's focused on soccer after 1975 and primarily in Portland, I'm going to drag a few of towns and cities up and down the valley into the conversation as well, at least by mention. There are just simply too many people to choose to put on the map that you see there in those 10 people. They are a representative cross-section, but there could literally have been 100. So to those who didn't make it, we apologize, but we stick with the fact that they are so well entrenched in Oregon soccer and have worked for so many different aspects of the game. There's an old saying that I like, which goes, no roots, no fruit. And I think it tells the story of soccer in Oregon. Because there were people playing and promoting soccer in Oregon before we arrived in 1975. with the Portland Timbers. I'd like to mention just a couple of those people: Ron Croft and Ted Zielinski in the amateur ranks, Bernie Rylett and Andy Clark as officials, Bob Ash at Catlin Gable High School, and a good friend of mine and former co-worker at the Portland Timbers, Dennis O'Meara, who passed away this past year, who went on to form club programs at PSU and at the University of Portland. I tried to look at the growth and try to put some ideas together as to why and how it happened. I can say from the very start of the Timbers in 1975, the Timbers owners, who were local, General Manager Don Paul and Coach Vic Crow, promoted an inclusive approach to Timbers in the community. We conducted somewhere in the region of over 1,000 clinics in the first 2 years of the club, at every service club, every high school, every grade school that we could get to. It was free of charge, and we basically scheduled in as you called in. What also led to growth in Portland was the fact that many of those 1975 Timbers stayed on in the community and continued with their soccer. Some names you'll recognise: Clive Charles, Jimmy Conway, John Bain, Brian Gann, Bernie Fagan, Tony Betts, Jimmy Kelly, Willie Anderson, Ray Martin, Bill Irwin, and myself from those early years. By assuming positions in the community and helped to continue to develop the sport, it gave the sport a good kick down the road. There's no question that the success of the 75 Timbers on and off the field helped the sport grow. But with that growth, we were charged to try to find qualified coaches. I took upon myself, when I first joined Nike with 3 other people: Dave Nicholas of Jesuit High School fame, Mike Davis at Catlin Gable, Verna Keys from Forest Grove. We started a licensing program, and on behalf of the OYSA, we went into the business of licensing coaches with national licenses acknowledged by US Soccer. I'm glad to say also that Oregon Youth Soccer Association's first and non-administrative soccer employees were Clive Charles and Jimmy Conway, who I think you could build a case to say that these are 2 people that have done more for soccer in Oregon than any other individual yet. The ethos of Soccer City USA meant that as each professional team went south, went defunct, there was an underlying soccer community that came about in those early days that then enabled the re-emergence of professional game with the Pride, the Pythons, the Rain, and the MLS Timbers, NWSL, Thorns, and UP Soccer. And we can't go any further without fully acknowledging the underlying support provided by the Timbers Army and the Rose City Riveters. They're there, they're always there. They're active in the community. They are groups of supporters that every player that's worn a shirt for Timbers or Thorns appreciate and acknowledge their contribution to the sport. I'd also think it's important to acknowledge the influence of Nike. Nike holds the US soccer contract and also sponsors the Portland Thorns. And as a result, many national team players, coaches, foreign clubs, foreign players under endorsement come through the Nike campus and somehow then get involved locally during their time here. Same goes for Adidas in their overall sponsorship of Major League Soccer, which includes quite obviously the Timbers. Whilst that growth was going on here locally, I also like to point out for the soccer enthusiasts or the historians what was happening in parallel on a national basis. There was a tremendous growth in media following the era of NASL and Pele with the New York Cosmos. The World Cups for both men and women brought more people to the fold as they watched World Cups on the various channels. We've seen the emergence of national broadcasters, including ESPN, ABC, NBC, SN, Fox Sports, and multiple Hispanic channels who came on board as the sport grew. Nationally, there was a rapid growth in youth soccer starting in the mid-70s to the current day, from about 250,000 members to today, where there are more than 3 million members, which are roughly split, incidentally, about 50-50 boys and girls. The visibility of the men's national team helped the growth here locally in 1990 as we tuned into the World Cup and saw our team at play. We've also seen the unparalleled success of hosting the FIFA World Cup of '94 in terms of record attendances and revenues, a time when the US showed the rest of the world that it was a soccer country indeed, and it could look forward to some great youth. The advent of the Major League Soccer and then WSL traceable back to the 1994 World Cup for the men and probably the 1999 World Cup for the women gave birth to those professional leagues, and they have obviously stimulated interest in soccer. I'd have to mention also Title IX, which came about 1972. This is the legislation by which university presidents and athletic directors have to field co-equally men's and women's sports in proportion to the demographics of men and women on campus. This helps soccer dramatically because athletic directors looking for ways and means to balance out what football was offering often chose soccer. The success of the women's national team winning the World Championship in 91, 99, 15 and 19 is unparalleled here in the States. They have led the way, especially in comparison to the men, and the men are busy trying to catch up with them. The successful hosting of the Women's World Cup in 1999 showed the world that women can indeed play good professional soccer and that American fans are interested in both the men's and women's games. In magnitude as well, because the attendances, sponsorship, revenues was the best it had ever been for a women's football event. A small known fact about one of the things I think has helped is the formation of a company called Soccer United Marketing, which in 2001 initially bought the rights to broadcast the World Cup 2002 and 2006, and off the back of that tagged on the MLS, meaning that for the first time in 2006, the MLS started to get some money for their broadcasting rights. And some, over the course of 20 years, have paid over $300 million in guarantees to US soccer, which has underwritten the sport at the national level. With all that growth came some associated challenges. So officials in the sport were looking for coaches, referees, additional fields, administrators, volunteers, and struggling to get media coverage. That all came with the unparalleled growth. We also faced the unpredictability of the professional game, as Morgen had pointed out, in terms of the various iterations of men's and women's professional teams. And we also stared in the face the increased costs associated with playing soccer at the youth soccer level, resulting in diminished opportunities for underserved communities, the challenge that we still have to this day. Some specific responses to the challenges was an increased number of coaches and officials licensing courses, software and online tools for officials and field assignments, which was greatly helped, but they're doing it by hand before, now you can do it by software and online. And we've also seen the growth of scholarships at every level of the game, from club teams to college teams now, to help those who do not have the means. And we've also seen a great professionalisation of administration of the game. I'd like to finish with a brief list of the successes that have come from this growth, because I think it's also important for us to understand it's been a struggle. It hasn't been easy. I can say from being here from 1975, it hasn't always been obvious just how successful soccer was to become in this city. So I like to look at the successes. I'd point out the extraordinary success of UP's women, winning 2 national championships in 2002 and 2005. The number of Women's World Cup winners who've played in Portland, from Raphael Milbert, Macmillan, French, Sonnet, Heath and Morgen. And indeed the Women's World Player of the Year, nominated by FIFA, again Rapinoe, who played a college soccer at University of Portland. UP men's soccer success have reached the NCAA semi-finals on 2 occasions in 1988 and 95. And we've seen a steady stream of national team players from this region, including on the men's side with Casey Keller, Chirundalo, Robles, Finley, Gordon and Johnson. We've seen the arrival of large schools in college soccer like Oregon State University with its quality coaches, facilities and programs. We have arguably the most successful combined men's and women's professional club in the US in the shape of Portland Timbers and Thorns, when you take them both together. The most supportive fans in the US. We've had 125 plus successive sellouts at Timbers games. We have the record for the highest single attendance at a Women's Professional League game for the Thorns in August of 2019 of just over 25,000 fans. And the Thorns also have the highest seasonal average attendances for 7 consecutive seasons, something we can all be proud of. We've had championship professional teams in the Timbers in 2015, Thorns in 13 and 17. We've hosted an all-star game in Major League Soccer. We've had 2 national youth soccer champions, FC Portland 1994 and Eastside United 2010. We've had a plethora of professional players, men's and women's, who played in Portland, the college and pros, and too many to mention, but great inspiration for all kids. We founded the Portland Timbers and Thorns Academies, and we've gotten soccer players and teams inducted into the Oregon Sports Hall of Fame after 25 years of no one being there. We got Clive Charles in 2003, Shannon Millen in 2007. The UP women's team of 2002 was elected in 2018. My own Timbers 75 team in 2019, Tiffany Millwood in 2020. We've created employment opportunities. It strikes me because as we came to the end of our career in the mid-70s here, there was nowhere to go in Oregon to make a profession other than outside the club. So now there are employment opportunities with Nike, Adidas, Portland Timbers, Thorns, UP, Oregon State, Portland State, Jersey Soccer, and the OYSA, as well as the Oregon Adult Soccer Association. And revenues from soccer has risen exponentially since 1975, generated primarily by the presence of Nike and Adidas, as well as our professional teams. So in summary, through soccer, Portland and other cities in Oregon have been connected with the world of soccer through players, coaches, teams, tournaments, camps, supporters groups, et al. The growth of soccer in Portland and Oregon has created a universe of soccer organizations and events that was unforeseeable for those of us involved with the sport in 1975. I suggest we are much the better as a result of this growth.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to open it up to questions and answers. And I want to thank our panelists and our presenters for doing just a fantastic job of walking us through the exhibit via photographs. The exhibit is on display until September, so I do hope that everyone gets a chance to come down to OHS if you're in the Portland, Oregon area, of course. And if not, I'm glad you could join us. The presentation was recorded, and so in about 3 weeks or so, it will be available on our OHS YouTube page. So definitely you can share it then and rewatch it. And so we're really glad that you could join us. Mick, I do have a couple of questions from you that came in from our audience. And one of them is, do you have any favorite stories from your years with Portland?
Oh my gosh. Where to start? Many of them come from that first season of 75. I've literally arriving in Portland. I think my wife Linda and I arrived on April 10th. I was the first player in town. Our first game was May the 2nd. So we had roughly about 6 weeks to get going before the season. So when players and coaches complain about short pre-seasons these days, I don't want to hear them. Coach Crow had put together a fantastic team, a team that could work together, a team that was blue-collar oriented. And so it was coming to Portland and seeing the response of the fans and the community that we can never forget. Those of us that played that first season often talk about it as the perfect summer. I think Chris Dangerfield quoted it. Everything came together. Portland found soccer, we found the fans. It was a love affair. And it's lasted this many years. I think one of the funniest ones I can remember is Mildred Schwab, City Commissioner, used to like a cigarette. And she would stand under the tunnel at Civic Stadium and puff away on a cigarette. And one of our players, Graham Day, also liked a cigarette. And unbeknownst to the coach, Graham and Mildred would often get together to share a cigarette in the tunnel before the game. I think it tells you a lot about the way the sport was then. It was competitive and fun. It was raw, and it's nowhere near as refined as today's sport, but it was very fun and enjoyable.
Perfect, thank you. And so this question is going to be both for Morgan and Libby, and I can jump into as well. But we had a question from Ryan that said, could you speak more about the exhibit development process, including the team input and how those 10 sections were finalized?
Yeah, so we were approached at Historical Research Associates by y'all at Oregon Historical Society that you knew you wanted to do this exhibit, in part because, I don't think I mentioned this, but 2020 is the 45th anniversary of the first era of the Timbers, 10th anniversary of the Timbers in Major League Soccer, 10th anniversary of the 107 Independent Supporters Trust. So we had a lot of historical moments happening. How we came about those 10 sections, I don't remember. I think it was pretty organic at the beginning. I had worked on an NASL Timbers specific exhibit years ago, which is how I met Mick and a lot of the other players from the 75 team. So I had that good foundation of the NASL era, and I attended a lot of Timbers games when they were at USL. But then we needed a lot of research to fill in the gaps. So it made sense pretty early on that we needed a chronological outline, but we had all this other great content that we wanted to flesh out more topically. And then the universe was, Mick, it was something you and I were kind of brainstorming about. And then you suddenly did all of this great research. And I presented our designers with the challenge of putting it in a big display to try to really show how impactful soccer has been. Am I missing anything, Libby?
I think the question included what was was something about the relationship with the teams. So we did work with the front office quite a bit, talking about just what their vision would be for what they would like to include, and they provided a lot of the photographs that we used. So a lot came from the 107ists, from Ray Terrell, and then from the front office. And then the process of narrowing it down, we didn't set out to have 10 sections. It just, like Morgan said, it's this organic, as we look at the things that come up a lot in research and in conversations with folks, we kind of start to mentally categorize it. And so our process is we went to the space. We're very familiar with that gallery at OHS, but it really helped to go there and just and we would sketch it out, like what might fit here, what might fit there. And so, like she said, that it made sense for the chronological part to be at the beginning to lead people in that way. And we moved things around. Some depended on design, where things would fit best with the interactives and the digital displays as well.
And we also heard that it was very important to end the exhibit on that community aspect of it and how important that community aspect was in the soccer world and what soccer has done both for Portland and for Portland youth and the youth clubs for Portland. So we wanted to make sure that we got all of that into the exhibit. And it was about a year-long process between kickoff and opening day. And of course, opening day was in July. So we had the additional challenge of doing exhibit install in the middle of a pandemic and opening for a couple of months for everybody to see. So I have another question for you, Mick, and that is, how has soccer fan culture changed throughout the years? And has anything remained the same?
Oh boy. Remain the same, I think, would be the level of fervor, because believe it or not, in the first year, there were small supporters groups. What's changed dramatically is the magnitude of everything in soccer. I mean, the size of the crowd, the refurbishment of the stadium, the prevalence of soccer in the media, about the supporters groups. I think they can be favourably compared with most groups of supporters around the world. They certainly would come out tops, I think, the combined two of Army and Riveters in the United States. The only thing that remains for both of those supporters group and soccer supporters is the longevity and what I would call the tradition of supporting soccer within families. So the support that goes from father or mother down to sister, son, daughter, et al., which is how I came to the game. It was through my dad and through my older brother, and we've passed it on to our kids and so on and so forth. And that's the only component, I think, that remains to be added, which is coming as we speak. We now see kids growing up watching the Thorns, the Timbers, UP, etc. And hopefully they will continue to bring their kids to the game here so that we have that tradition of soccer within the family.
Perfect, thank you. We have a question from Bob. How many ex-Timbers have remained in the area? And I also had another follow-up question to that. And where are some of the Timbers now from the NASL era?
NASL era, we have John Smiley, Chris Dangerfield and Nick Nicholas in the Bay Area. They stay in contact with one another. In fact, Nick and John Smiley work together in a travel company. Chris Dangerfield is in the San Jose area too. In Portland, we have many from that 75 with Willie Anderson, Tony Betts, Jimmy Kelly, myself, Bill Irwin, who followed, John Bain, Brian Gant. And so we have a lot of that early era NASL players still in town, and they've mostly been involved in soccer in many ways. And then overseas, we have scattered across the UK, some of those 75 players, Barry Powell, Peter With, who went on to great success, Barry Lynch, etc. And we've lost a couple of players along the way. Unfortunately, we lost our coach in Vic Crow, who really deserves great credit for putting together that first year, because with all the success of the first year, which gave us a good platform for the sport, he pulled that off in a couple of months, which I think is extraordinary. And it deserves a special mention. And I think his son, Stuart, was meant to be on the broadcast. I don't know if he joined us, but if you are there, Stuart, hello, and best wishes to you for the holidays.
Bernie Fagan too, right? I don't know if you mentioned him, Mick.
Sorry?
Bernie Fagan.
Bernie Fagan, yes. Bernie, who's been, well, did a heck of a lot in the sport. He's always had a system of camps going in town here, and he was instrumental in the formation of the Warner Pacific College program. So forget Bernie, because he was originally a sounder.
Mm.
So, you know, it's hard to take them on board, those kissing cousins, you know, so.
Yeah, well, we can all celebrate that they lost on Saturday. So
I would say celebrate, but yeah, I'm happy for Coach Porter and for Darlington as well, and for the fans of Columbus, because they kept that team alive, which is special.
Okay, great. I have a question that I'm going to also answer, but I want Morgen and Libby to jump in. I'm just going to take all the questions. And one of the questions is can you talk about the process of collecting some of the items that are featured in the exhibit, like the fan memorabilia? So for those fan memorabilia, just like the scarves, some of them came from the 107ists who let us borrow a lot of their objects. Some of them came from our OHS collection that we have. And some of them came from the front office. So they're definitely, it's a community donation of some of those. And some of them have been permanently into our OHS collection. Some of them are just on temporary loan. And then we will return them when the exhibit is done. But Morgan, did you want to talk about the scarves a little more?
Yeah, the scarves was a harebrained idea that I had early on in the project that I wanted to get 1,000. We got 290, but they came from a range. OHS actually has a really great collection from Giselle Courier. I think 25 of the scarves are from that. 107ist provided tremendous amounts of scarves. Super wonderful to work with in every aspect of the project. The front office for both teams provided scarves, and then we just found scarf collectors. I went on a website and did so much research to make sure that we weren't repeating designs and had spreadsheets, and it was a fun challenge to install that with our masks and tie them up with zip ties and put them overhead in this special hanging mechanism we developed. And
Yep.
we worked with, sorry, Tara, but we worked with all kinds of individuals and organizations, Oregon Sports Hall of Fame, other folks to just get a wide range of objects.
Absolutely. And I wanted to add the Patch Patrol and different aspects of the 107ists, the Rose City Riveters, and the Timbers Army. And the Timbers front office and the Thorns front office have most certainly jumped in and let us borrow a whole bunch of stuff for this exhibit. So I did get a notice that we're really running low on time. So I'm going to answer this question really quick from Stephen. How has the exhibit been received by OHS members and the general public? So far, it's been received fantastic. Since we've been open, the exhibit was really only on display for about 4 months before we had to close to the public. So I'm very thrilled that we've been able to do this virtual program just to get that exhibit and all of that hard work out more to the public. And then when we're open again, we expect to have a ton more people coming in and seeing this exhibit on display until September. So I want to thank everybody again and our panelists for joining us for today's program. And we look forward to seeing you guys soon in person when it is safe to do so. Otherwise, happy holidays.
Thanks, Tara and Mick and everyone for joining us. It's been really wonderful. We're super proud of this exhibit and to share this community history with everyone.